The other important thing here that really gets to the new consumption model that we are in is the concept of operational storage, right? And I really want to focus on this because everyone does this right now, for right or for wrong. Welcome to the cloud. Please store us to, please pay us to store our data, right? It's kind of tongue in cheek, to be quite candid. Obviously, we have to store data, and in the new architectures that we look at within Dynamics 365, for example, focus on making it so that we minimize the amount of data that are in our OLTP systems, online transactional processing. So that would be D365 sales, that would be D365 BC or finance and operations, right? We want to minimize the amount of data that's inside of there because we want to make that fast for users. We've all seen what happens when we have too much data in one table and we go through that process, right? So the thing to note here is part of that reporting and data strategy should focus around what type of data is stored in what type of repository, because it is actually becoming a little more common now to even mine information in emails to be able to do things like sentiment analysis that uses that content of the email to say whether it was a happy email, a sad email, a good email, an email that needs to be escalated. And with these GPT technologies that we've started to see as well, with all those different types of machine learning models, this is going to be a much bigger thing then as well, because it's going to allow you to even possibly automate replies potentially to responses that your customers have actually provided to you. So know that the storage alignment is a very critical component inside of your strategy. Number one, data lake. Great area then to be able to store the data that you have from your records inside of Dynamics 365 so that you can access it then from Power BI. But at the same point, you don't want to store attachments inside of Dynamics 365. Typically, you want to store attachments in maybe another storage account or maybe in a OneDrive, for example, with Business Central. So make sure you start defining where the alignment is for those data sources so that when you're having BI developers that are accessing this information, they know where to get it. And they also understand as well that the binary data is not in a record, so it doesn't cause those queries to be slower as you go through that process. Other things to note from an operational storage perspective, each of these different storage methodologies actually has a different cost related to them. So data lake, for example, can be super cheap. It's almost like a penny a gigabyte. Whereas if you want to store a gigabyte inside of finance and operations, you're going to pay $40 a month extra for 1 gigabyte of space. I don't know about you, but a penny versus $40 feels like a much more economical spend when it comes to data that may just be used for reporting, right? So the other thing to note here is that the segregation of this data by using these storage technologies to store the larger sets of data needs to be a part of your strategy, because then when you design, for example, your BI cubes that relate to this, you can do other advanced topics. Like you can actually start caching some of this data as you go through that process. And then finally, archiving is another aspect that really needs to be considered as you go through this as well. Now, some of the things that I just want to highlight here, there are some technologies that you should be considering here when it comes to what do you use for storage. And these are the common ones. It's not all of them, but obviously these are the common ones from a Microsoft perspective with it, where we use, for example, storage accounts, for example, for Azure data storage. It's a storage account. I don't know if you know, but storage accounts are actually data lakes. But with data lakes, you actually enable what we call ADLS extensions on that storage account. So storage accounts are also a very valid way to store information, along with OneDrive, SharePoint, Exchange, and then the business system data. Just make sure you're going through and classifying these so that you know where that data is going to land as you go through that particular process. So from a reporting perspective now, this is where the rubber starts to hit the road when it comes to those decisions that you have made. Reporting is a whole new paradigm in the modern business system space. Old system space, we would use SQL Server reporting services or maybe even the report viewer component to actually go through and build reports that had data sets that we used a what you see is what you get environment. We drag and drop it on there, and then we try to create charts and graphs and drill throughs, and it worked okay, but it was a lot of work. And as many of you probably know, when you asked for a BC report to be customized, typically the default response from a partner will be it's at least 40 hours to go through and do that. Well, with our new architecture, really what we have now is the ability to take data models that you've gone through and defined by doing really all that work of identifying where conversions go, where master data is going to land, and where all those processes are being consumed into basically an area now where we can now build models and then use that to create really amazing dashboards to interact with. So we're moving from the line level report concept to KPI driven dashboards that should be smart enough to tell you where those issues are so that you can drill down into those and then identify, for example, or even have it identify what the issues are that you need to interact with. So the concept of driving line level reports, well, I get it for shareholder reports, I get it for balance sheet, income statement, and for some of the financial reports. For a lot of the operational reports that you have, where you may be looking at revenue numbers or billable time if you're a professional services organization, or for example, your on time shipments as a distributor, or as your production times for production orders or batch orders and how long it's taking compared to what was estimated, for example. These are perfect examples of moving away from a line level report to be able to drive that information to having a dashboard that you can access anywhere to get to that information. So start to think through the concepts in reporting that are going to be different, because the reason you're moving to a modern system is the fact that your old system isn't doing what you want it to do anymore. And it may not be the reporting that's driving it, but with the migration to a new business system, it's a cultural change, like I said before as well. So make sure that you embrace that and you really focus on building architectures that centralize data or large amounts of data, for example, inside of a data lake, and then use Power BI then to basically create controls that you can interact with then to ask questions around your data. The other aspect just to kind of consider here as well is the fact that if you try to tackle both an OLTP and what we used to call OLAP, right? The online analytical processing, which is really the BI that you typically tackle in your implementations. If you try to do both of those, just know that that's going to be a really hard thing to manage. Why is that? All right, we're going from an operational perspective. We're talking through a workload, an opportunity, for example. We talk through 5 different fields that we need to add because we need to track that information. And of course, for you, it's probably pretty self explanatory. You need those fields because you have this report, but maybe you haven't mentioned that you have that report that's needed for it. Maybe you have too. It doesn't matter. It doesn't change the context of this example. If I'm making those changes, and at the same point then I'm trying to align a BI developer to basically then summarize, aggregate, and create those measures, as we call them, inside of the business intelligence world, and a developer has not added those yet, for example, to that table, and you haven't tested it yet to make sure it's acting the same way that you wanted. Maybe it's an option field set, and during discussion as you go through this iterative process of software design, which is what we tackle typically, you identify that you need additional values for it. Well, if you're constantly having that change, it's really hard to keep those two teams aligned as you go through that process. So it's important at a minimum to ensure that you have defined your data architecture and that it is static or as static as possible before you start looking at involving then a business intelligence architecture that you're going to use to be able to really drive that. So something just to note here is that you want to make sure you sequence this correctly for your BI strategy, and that should be something where you give enough time then as well as part of that to be able to then create those reports because they are going to take effort and they're even going to possibly cause rework on the transactional side as well. And you need to consider that as you go through this process. So, just something to note. It's something I've seen many times that customers at the end of it, reporting's always thought of not as deeply, and then there's a lot of pain that occurs with it as you go through that. And then finally, less paper, more digital. We've got tablets, we have phones. You don't need to print out 5,000 pages and use a yellow Sharpie to go through and identify the exceptions. Make it on a dashboard where the exceptions are what brings to you front and center the actions that you may need to do. In our organization, we track billable percentages, as you can imagine. Well, with that, because we're professional services, if we're not hitting that, we've got a KPI that says this is where we're short so that we can look at that information. So design your reports not around the metrics that you don't need to see. Design these around the controls that you need to be able to see where you're going and where things are not going well. And then from there, use those reports obviously to drill down to the next layer of details you go through that process. Now, the benefits of this then, I'm just going to leave this slide up really quickly and go through it at a high level. Obviously, it allows you to basically transfer ownership from a reporting perspective because you now understand what those metrics are and you own it. The infrastructure you have is a consistent environment, basically, so that you can now align these BI developers and this data and where it's stored very quickly and easily. You have now history, for example, inside of data lakes that you can snap in with this using Synapse and some of the other tools that are there. And then obviously a lot of these metrics that are industry standard, you could potentially even reuse out of the box because there's a bunch of reports already that come with Dynamics 365 that allow us to basically hit the ground running as we go through that process. So, kind of finally here as well, from a strategy perspective, think of this when you go through your BI strategy. Build a scalable system that can go through the different evolutions that I'm going to show here in just a second. Define that architecture and be consistent with that definition, even from a terminology perspective, where you may need to map some of that from the application to the repository, but focus on making sure that you use a common language and consistency with those integrations and conversions as well as you go through that process. Use that summary to detail concept. Start with, for example, exceptions or metrics that drive you to make a decision instead of just blasting information on a dashboard. And then build reports that end users don't have to hunt to find the information, but it's there as kind of a common question then so that you can then answer it as you go through that. And then once again, you don't have to tackle everything inside of Power BI. You can use lists and views. You can create Power Apps inside of a Power BI report that accesses then the Dynamics 365 data to show you the transactional detail with it. And finally, don't always try to recreate the exact same report that you had in the old system. We all know where that can land us when we try to actually create something that isn't the same, right, as compared to where we are from a technology perspective as we go through this. For the evolution here, I want to show this just really quickly because I think this will get your guys' mind spinning a little bit more on really this journey of data. So if I'm a small organization, like 5 to 10 users, for example, I may directly query against my database for reporting. I may not use Azure Data Lake at all, and that's perfectly valid because I don't even have multi-workload. And really, all I'm going to use for tools is Power BI that I'm going to point directly to Business Central or Finance and Operations, or maybe even Dataverse to be able to drive, obviously, my reporting requirements. Because that volume is not that high, you don't have to really worry as much about that technology and the impact of it when you're running those particular reports. Now, there's exceptions to every rule here, but generally speaking, when we look at the architecture needs that are there for a customer, these are some of the major commonalities that we see then when going through and actually maintaining and implementing these sites. So when we start moving, for example, to a small medium type customer, 11 to 40 users, right? And once again, these are kind of generalizations, but you're going to start seeing the reduction of direct queries against the database. You're going to start seeing the usage, for example, of data lakes, because you actually do now have applications or multi workloads, such as having a CRM and an ERP, and you want that data to land in a common repository that your BI team and data team can actually access to build out those reports. So this introduces now beyond just Power BI, the concept of data lake that you may be using commonly for these. And so at this size, this is typically what we see then for the tooling that's required for it. When you start moving to a medium-sized business, right? This is 41 to 250 users, and we can, there's some, wiggle room here. I'm meaning full users. I'm not meaning like activity or even team member users. But at the high level here, what we're starting to see is much less direct query against databases because now you have a larger user base that could impact production from a performance perspective. So Azure Data Lake is pretty much a need then at this size because then as well you're typically tackling things like sales and marketing and field service and finance and operations, as you can imagine, in your workload. So this multi-workload concept is really becoming bigger in your organization. And typically now we're starting to elevate ourselves beyond then really the direct query into now we're using data lake to store our data. We're using Synapse to join those data lake repositories into one view so that we can then consume that inside of Power BI. And we're also using tools like Azure Data Factory to move data around to go through that processing. Now, let's go a little bit bigger here now as well. Let's get to the medium large, 251 to 1,000 users. You've got data governance now typically that's involved in here. There are no direct queries typically against this that is occurring at a customer that is this size, or they're very occasional as you go through that. You're starting to develop Azure Data Lake and hub and spoke models with it, where you may actually have multiple data lakes because maybe you're dealing with regions now as well as you go through that. You're absolutely in multi workload, and you're now starting to say, hey, you know what? When I run these reports, I have so much data now that I really need to summarize it so that the performance then of these reports works well then from a BI and data perspective. So I'm going to start introducing then Azure analysis services, very similar to an OLAP cube that you're going to then manage with it. And so you can see here that we're now introducing beyond Synapse then, obviously these analysis services that you may be using to point towards your data. And quite commonly, the analysis services has the cubes and data that you need to be able to basically run the business because that's the high performance aspect that you need. Whereas then you use data lake for those types of queries where you're discovering more about your business as you go through that process. And then finally on the large ones, right? This is 1,000+ users. This is overgeneralized because there's actually other tiers here as well. But for the sake of time, we have in this example the introduction of really truly regional data designs. So we're dealing with GDPR then when dealing with Europe, for example, or EMEA as we go through that process. We're starting to introduce even more tools like Spark, Databricks, and HD Insights as we go through this because they do better at, for example, taking large sets of data and then interacting and consuming them. So this introduces a whole different level. But as you can kind of see at the bottom from a tooling perspective, if you follow the path of Power BI, Data Lake, analysis services, Synapse, you are pretty much aligning then for each of these evolutions that you may go through from a business perspective as you go through this process. So kind of with that, guys, we're getting close on time here. Let's go ahead and wrap this up. So last couple areas that I want to talk through from a governance perspective. So remember, governance is a critical component of your data and BI strategy. You should be defining this as much as possible to align people, processes, and technology to then be able to support your security, your master data, the data quality, the architecture, and the integration as you go through that. And candidly, there's a couple of options that you have from governance models that you should be considering. And you don't have to implement all of this upfront all at once, right? And that's something I really want to stress here is the fact that you can start by making sure you're defining high level data governance and then keep on iterating on that to go deeper and deeper to basically then align the data, who owns it, what the accountabilities are for that, how we manage it, how we execute off of it, how we actually go through and then define that data and manage that change. There's all these different options that you can use then from a data governance perspective to finally get to those goals and metrics to be able to then drive those decisions inside of your organization. So just know governance, build a governance framework for your data that then includes obviously the metrics from BI and the intelligence that's needed for it. So that way, ultimately, you're aligned with a lot of those discussions and decisions that need to occur inside of your organization. And finally, here, let's think about the future, right? There's a lot happening. I keep on telling people 5 years ago, I could pretty much tell you kind of how things are going with the new AI based capabilities. It's really hard now, right? Because it's hard to see what the future is going to be here. But from this perspective, know that we're starting to see much more AI in our market. We've got GPT, we've got the ability now to basically generate emails, responses, we can write papers if we want to with it, but know that machine learning really looks at statistical information regarding what is going to be the outcome of the next event. We're basically using statistics to identify probability, right? So if you are not collecting the data that you may use to be able to define that model or that probability, well, then you're not going to be able to have an accurate model, right? So a big thing here is know that from a data perspective, that you are going to want to track more of this data in the future. And it's a really key component that Microsoft is even going to be using for some of their different processes. An example is even like Power Virtual Agents now has the ability for you to point it to your internal knowledge base, and it will go through and identify the topics and the decisions and the information around it. And you can now use the GPT technology to ask questions about your knowledge base so that you can actually get to information quicker and faster. So there's just a lot that's coming down the pike that you need to consider. But I want to stress this one last time. Capture as much of the data as you can without making it so that it becomes cumbersome for your end users. And that's something obviously that we can help you identify and align with so that you're not also going into the death by transaction that is very common when people try to get too much data, as we've talked about before, because we are not at that size or scale to be able to support that data. Then in that situation, well, you've got to invest in automation strategies maybe to make it so that you do have the ability to capture that. And you should be thinking down that path more often than not in the future here as we go through this. So kind of in summary, high level, just really quickly here, make sure you document obviously what you're going to be doing from your government and from your strategy perspective on all the areas that we kind of discussed through. Make sure you're standardizing as well the terminology and the process capabilities that you're expecting as part of this. And then also make sure you're defining what the risk is with these different systems so that you know, obviously, as to where it's going to be harder to get that type of data that you're going to need inside of your business intelligence and reporting. And start with measured success. Make small wins for people. Make a win for someone so that they can see what the power is and the capabilities are of the solution so that that can spread like wildfire in your organization so that you have proponents that have seen this actually work. And don't try to do everything all at once as you go through this. And then finally, make sure you future proof really your designs and architecture by thinking about how you're going to scale this journey as things evolve and as your organization hopefully grows to be able to support that.